At 10:50 on your dial, this is WSTS Radio, Massena, New York, the voice and choice of the North Country and Canada, too. Eastern Daylight Savings Time, 9:30 a.m. Time for Action Central News headlines and weather. Yours truly, Ira Zimmerman, reporting this edition. First in the headlines on the world and national scene, Senator Estes Kefauver has died of a ruptured heart vessel in Bethesda, Maryland Naval Hospital. The Tennessee senator was 60 years of age. Funeral services for the infant son of President and Mrs. Kennedy are being held in Boston today with only close relatives of the President and First Lady in attendance. Weathermen say Hurricane Arlene, with winds up to 100 miles an hour at her center, is now heading toward eastern Canada's maritime provinces. Secretary of State Dean Rusk has arrived in West Germany to rally support for the limited nuclear test ban treaty. And British banks are still calculating losses in history's biggest train robbery, with the loot now totaling more than $7 million. On the New York State scene, special state consultants will be on hand Monday at employment offices in New York City to help Negroes seeking construction jobs. Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered them to help out. The weather picture for northeastern New York State and the St. Lawrence Valley: partly cloudy and not quite so warm today. High temperature mostly in the 70s. Fair and somewhat cooler tonight, the low expected between 45 and 55. Tomorrow mostly sunny with the high in the 70s and 80s. Presently, our street level temperature in downtown Massena, 62 degrees. Those are the news headlines and the weather. A quick look at the ball scores. In the American League, the White Sox and Tigers divided 2-1 White Sox in the opener, 3-1 Tigers in the nightcap. The Orioles beat the Senators 7-1. The Athletics topped the Indians 5-1. The Twins beat the Red Sox 5-3, and the Yankees beat the Angels 1-0. In the National League, the Colts and Pirates split 2. Identical 7-6 scores in both games in extra innings. In single games, the Mets beat the Cubs 7-3. The Giants beat the Phillies 4-0. The Braves down the Cardinals 6-3, and the Reds beat the Dodgers 8-4. In the International League, it was Buffalo 4, Syracuse 3, Toronto 9, Columbus 3, Rochester 6, Indianapolis 2, Arkansas 7, Jacksonville 3, and Atlanta 3, Richmond 2. Those are the scores. We'll have Action Central News and weather again on the hour at 10 o'clock, a 5-minute summary. Right now, our good morning time about 9:32, and about this time for another one of our Saturday morning chat sessions, roundtable discussions, call it what you will, for this 9:30 to 10 o'clock portion. And by popular demand and request, we have a return engagement today. Two young men who were here a few weeks ago. I don't have my calendar schedule with me. I don't remember about how long ago, but it was several weeks ago. And they talked about things in days gone by in Massena, and many people heard them and enjoyed it and asked that we bring them back, and we have done so. One gentleman here, well known in Massena presently, the town historian, Mr. Anthony Romeo. The other gentleman, a former newspaperman in Massena, Mr. Fred Holliday. And Mr. Romeo has brought Mr. Halliday back as a guest. And as an introduction for many people, I'm sure, who didn't hear the program of several weeks ago, I'll ask you, Tony, to just give us a brief rundown again, the background about Mr. Fred Halliday, where he lives now, and just what he did as a newspaperman. You, as, how shall I say, the sponsor here this morning. For the many people who didn't hear us a few weeks ago, tell us a bit about Mr. Halliday, because he's probably too modest to say these things about himself.
Well, I'll have to say that Mr. Holliday is probably one of the best known men around here, not only because of him being in business or in the business eye, public eye for a long time, but also he has a verve for coming up for the unusual while he was a newspaper man. And some of the things that he has gone through in his life are very, very interesting to everyone, because it's so closely connected with the history of our town, the highlights of history, the very interesting and the fabulous days of the springs and all that. Mr. Holliday went through that. He lived it. And I don't think there's anyone qualified any more than Mr. Holliday to speak of those days, and that is why he was asked back, and I'm glad to have him, because he's a very, very valuable source of information.
Well, thank you for those few words, Tony. Let me get over here now to Mr. Halliday. And first of all, I know you sit right where you are, sir. How are you this fine day, first of all?
Well, as good as could be expected.
Well, I think you're looking pretty good. Did any people comment to you a few weeks ago? They heard you on the radio and said about all the things you were talking about?
I don't get out enough to see very many people nowadays, but call me on the phone and say, what business have you got in there? And so forth, and we had a lot of jokes over it. They'd say, you think you know everything.
Well, I guess you told them, huh? Now, I know one of what should I say, the items of interest in the Massena area in some of the days gone by is Massena Springs, as Tony has mentioned. I wonder if you could tell us, Mr. Halliday, a little bit about Massena Springs in some of the olden days, some of the hotels that were there, or some of the activity that took place on the river. Do you recall?
Well, as far as the Springs is concerned, there were much as a dozen hotels of different sizes at the Springs in the summer. They came to take the benefit they got from the spring water, and there was many or more people, hotels, large and small, over town, the business section, and it was the big business of the community, not only in Massena but out in the country. You know, they come to take the baths and use the spring water for their trouble. And I was head bellboy in the Hatfield House. That was the largest hotel, built in about 71, and it could accommodate around 200 people. And that was only opened from May to September, through September. And then Mr. Hatfield, a businessman from New York City, was interested in the spring water, and then they built a large hotel to accommodate.
What year did you work at the Hatfield House? Do you remember? You said the hotel itself opened about 1871. When were you there? Around the turn of the century or so?
I was there, and let me see. I came back from Wisconsin, from Indiana. I lived in Wisconsin 2 years and a half, Indiana 2 years and a half. My father died there, and the family came back here. Well, it was when I came back, 1892, to be about 1895.
1895, you worked at the Hatfield House. I'd say that was a while ago. Let me ask, you mentioned there were many hotels in the area at the Springs. Perhaps either Mr. Halliday or you, Tony, know, were these hotels situated all along what is now Hatfield Street generally, or how were they situated? Tony?
Well, they were in the general area. You see, there was the Bentley House that was across the river. That burned in about 92. Then there was the Hatfield, the Harrogate, the Nightingale, the Smith House, of course the Brunswick and the Albion, where had started operation before all this thing petered out. There were the Wheeler House was there, and they were all in the general area. There were a tremendous number of them. As Mr. Holliday pointed out, there were also other hotels. Now, there was one on Barnhart Island, and there was another one down East Strawberry Street, the Maple View, that a lot of people don't remember about. And then the White's Hotel, the Riverside, the Pittsburgh House, which was called the Graveyard Inn. It's today Violi's. There was the Power City, the Riverside, the St. James. There were so many hotels. Well, from 18 hotels, we went down to 18 rooms over the bank.
That was about the size of it, huh? I was going to ask one other thing. Oh, what were basically the golden years of the Springs? What years was it when it was really flourishing the most? Do you recall that, Mr. Halliday? That was when, about the 1890s through?
Let me see. You see, when it was first noted that spring water was good for some ailments, it was when the white people began to settle.
Way back.
Way back. Before, anyway. Well, as the white people came and settled, they noticed that there were paths beaten in the territory, and all led right to this spring. And they, of course, went to investigate, and they found that the Indians were using it and come long distances to use the water. They take hot baths and drink it and so forth. So they got interested, and as the white people came, the business increased. That was before my time. You see, I was born 1875, and we went away from the railroad came in here in '86, and we went away on the first train that carried passengers and went to Wisconsin. My father was a builder, and he used to go around the country. And we were 2.5 years in Wisconsin and 2.5 years in Indiana, and then my father died in 1892, and we came back here.
Now, when you came back here, you started to do some newspaper work for the Syracuse papers with their offices here. Did you have any big stories of the day concerning the springs in those days?
Yes, we'd mention it as often as we could because people were and those that were afflicted with some disease or trouble that this water would help would be interested if somebody was benefited and went back home. Naturally, they'd tell everybody. And there were a lot of people now. The Hatfield House was the largest hotel, and they could accommodate about 200 people. But they only kept open during the summer. They'd open it in May, and close in September, and he'd go back to New York.
Tony, let me ask you, now how long did the springs kind of flourish until it started to peter out? When were the years when things started to go by the boards?
Well, actually, it was, when you'd figure it out, it was roughly 100 years. It was a century. When you figure that still in 1912 and 13 there were still some people coming, and you figure that the people were coming before the Smith House was built in 1822. The Smith House was the first hotel or public accommodation that was built for that purpose. So before that, a period of 6-7 years, they were in boarding houses or anywhere they could get. So it was just about 100 years that the springs flourished, and then people started taking on new interests. The aluminum company was here, and industries and all, and the summer border began to disappear. The buildings started going into decline, you know, and the youngsters coming up didn't follow in the footsteps of the oldsters, didn't do any repairing, and of course fire was one of the great levelers of the era, and it just never was rebuilt. And then Saratoga Springs cut in quite some because of the fact that it was closer to New York, and they were able to corner some government money, which we didn't seem to go after. But I would say the golden century was just about that, just about 100 years. Yeah.
Ended about the time of the First World War then, or somewhere around that time. All righty, listen, we're going to carry on here in just a little while with some more talk with Tony Romeo and Fred Holliday concerning some of the days gone by in Massena. Right now we're going to pause for just a moment or two for station identification and a public service announcement. I would tell you that your dial is set at 1050 WSTS Radio, Massena, New York. Our good morning time is 16.5 minutes before 10. We'll be back in just a little while, but first this message on behalf of the Red Cross.
Hello, folks. This is Vaughn Monroe for the Red Cross.
That was Vaughn Monroe for the Red Cross, and this is yours truly, Ira Zimmerman, here with you this Saturday morning, carrying on with Mr. Tony Romeo and Mr. Fred Holliday, talking about some of the days of the bygone era of Massena and Massena Springs. Mr. Holliday was mentioning that his father was a builder in the area before they left town. Could you tell us a little bit about what area your dad developed or worked on, or any buildings we might know of these days?
He had charge of the building of the Hatfield House, and he built the Clark block, the store there on the corner, and the Episcopal Church, and the last two jobs that he had was building the Episcopal Church and the Clark block.
Let's go way back for a while. When did your father come to the Massena area? Now, you were born, you said, in 1875. When did your father come to this part?
Well, he came when he was born.
He was born in Massena?
Yeah.
My goodness, you really go back. When did the first holidays come to Massena then? When the grandfather or great-grandfather or whatever?
That was so far back that they didn't tell me.
They were on a Mayflower, huh? Well, my goodness. Tony, let me ask you, just a few days ago we finished up old-fashioned days with which you had a big part. Mr. Holliday, did you see any of the festivities last week that we had here in town with old-fashioned days?
I wasn't off the lot.
You weren't off the lot, huh? Okay. Tony, let me ask you, what were some of the things that best impressed you during our old-fashioned days festivities last week? What do you think about it generally?
Well, the thing that impressed me most, of course, was the participation, the sense of humor that goes into it, and I really want to comment and compliment the communication services, the newspapers and the radio stations for the coverage that they did. Unfortunately, we didn't seem to throw ourselves into it generally as we have in the past, but possibly it was one of those lean years, and I think that next year we'll profit by it, and I think we'll increase the potential. I thought the Keystone Cops were really tremendous. There was still more that could have been done, but as I say, this year, for some reason or other, there seemed to be a little bit of a cutback, but I think that that'll only be a warning for next year to plan heavier and better. The parade I liked. I liked some of the characterizations that they were portrayed and so on and so forth. I tried to disappear to a certain extent. And
you didn't disappear very well in that mayor outfit there that we saw you around in. I think the people probably saw the picture that Nick Podgorski took, which was in the Massena Observer the other day. That was pretty cute. Where'd you get that get-up from?
Well, I've had that for a number of years. As a matter of fact, I've used it on the stage for quite some time, and it wasn't new. I was caught in between this time. I hadn't prepared for a costume, and the last minute I just had to dig into my own trunk and bring out what I had, because I've been busy with this new institution of our historic center, and I really wasn't able to get out as much as last year.
You know, whenever we talk about history of an area, we're always interested in famous people who may have visited here. And I remember last time when we were here with Mr. Holliday and Mr. Romeo a few weeks ago, some of the people they mentioned, that Mr. Holliday mentioned he had seen and known and talked to, was Eleanor Roosevelt, among some others. And I was wondering, again, I didn't give you any time to think about this, Mr. Holliday, but in the days when you were a newspaper man here, chasing around and writing stories and meeting people, any other very famous people you had occasion to meet and talk to and interview and had some unusual experiences with, left some lasting impressions besides Mrs. Roosevelt?
We didn't consider meeting those people by chance. An event, we just got what they had and went and looked for somebody else.
That was part of the job, huh?
Yeah.
Who else? Do you remember any other names besides Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt that would be, you know, very well known?
I met a lot of them, but in 10 minutes it'd be on my mind. I'd have it down on paper, and that's saying that one.
Get to the next story.
You go to the next one.
Well, let me ask you, while we're talking about the people in the stories, we mentioned this several weeks ago, but we might get into a few other items. Do you remember any one or two particular stories, any really big events that you were right in on firsthand that were kind of a scoop for you, or some of the big stories of the year that you covered?
Well, you see, it's pretty near 10 years now since I was in the newspaper business, and it wasn't anything so remarkable to meet these people. They come and went, and I gave all my clippings and everything of that kind that I thought they could make use of.
Tony, do you have clippings in the museum of some of Mr. Halliday's work? It's a good segue.
I gave him all the clippings I had, everything that I had ever saved or anything. I gave to him to make use of it as he could.
Well, right. We might mention Massena, of course, has the new historical museum being run by town historian Tony Romeo in the building next to the Massena Town Hall downtown. Tony, any new additions in recent weeks that the people might not know about or we haven't mentioned in the museum?
Roughly, I'd like to comment on the clippings. I've discovered that Mr. Holliday, you ask him about any special story. I will tell you this. Mr. Holliday was in on every story that happened. I mean, it's difficult for him to pinpoint them. And besides that, he got feature stories. He'd go out and get the unusual story, and he ran these features in the Post-Standard, and I have discovered them in these items that he gave me, and they're tremendous. And now, as far as the museum is concerned, we call it our historic center. It isn't exactly a museum as such. However, we have items in there that were used in Massena that defy description.
Such as?
Well, we have one piece that is the most beautiful thing you ever saw, and it's been described everything from a samovar to a hanging lamp, and it isn't that. And I'd really would prefer that people would come in and cast their eyes on it and try to guess what it is. We have a companion to it that I just set up, and that also, and they're beautiful. Now, these things here aren't just a matter of usefulness. They were decorative as well, and they're marvelous. And I don't want to spoil it for someone like telling the end of a mystery story, but we have items coming in every day. Now, the other day, someone discovered we didn't have a hanging lamp, one of those beautiful lamps, and we got one. Someone called me the other day and told me about a bird that was very interesting. A bird that was of some interest here in Massena. I don't know exactly.
A stuffed bird.
A stuffed bird,
Oh.
yes. And there's something connected to it, and I don't know exactly what it is until I unearth it. I'm still waiting for an opportunity to go down. And we have such things. We have the movie. It was made here in Massena, and one of the lights that was used.
Yeah, I saw that.
And there's so many things in there that I could be here all day trying to describe. We have John L. Sullivan's boxing gloves. Of course, they were training gloves. They fought with.
How'd you ever come upon those?
Well, that was through the good graces of the Sullivan family. They were given to the Sullivan boys, Harry and Tom, who are both passed away since. They were given to those two boys as youngsters, as they were related in some manner. And they passed on one to the other until after Harry passed away. Then Mrs. Harry Sullivan, she turned them over to us, and we have them there. And it really is a thrilling thing to know, because John L. Sullivan spent an awful lot of time here at the Brunswick Hotel, which is now Gardner's, and we like to talk about those famous people that came.
What brought John L. Sullivan to Massena? How did he get tracked up here?
Well, he had a companion and some sort of a trainer and manager, a combination of each, named Bush. And this Bush rented the hotel for the summer months, and he'd bring Sullivan here as an attraction, and also as a place to rest, and also a place to train, or what have you. And all in all, it worked out pretty good. John L. was known to many people personally, and there's some of the most beautiful stories you ever heard were told about.
I can tell you an instant when I was in Indiana. I was a paper boy, and I was delivering the papers around. But kind of corner across the street from where I lived, Sullivan visited every little while. So I went up on the veranda, and he looked at me, and I said, "Hello, Mr. Sullivan, will you have the paper?" It was the Indianapolis News that I was. So, "Why, yes, young man," he says, "come over." And he held out his hand to shake hands. I'd take both my hands and a couple of feet to cover. And so he patted me on the back, knocked my breath all out, and we talked a little while. And he says, wait a minute, where did you come from?" Well, I said, "Ordinarily, I come from Massena, New York." He stopped and thought, and then he mentioned this friend that he had over at the Springs. For God's sake, I wish I was there now. I got a friend there and told me all about it. Well, we talked for a few minutes, and then about 2 years after that, I come back, and my father died, and we came right back. My father died in September, and we were back here the first week in December. Well, John came over to visit Bush over at the Springs, and I knew Bush well. And of course, the newspaper man, even a kid gets acquainted with people. So I stepped up the steps and got there Sullivan's, and then I was tired, and he looked at me, and I says, Hello, Mr. Sullivan. I meet you way here after. God, he says, I had seen you before somewhere. So I told him, called his attention to the event there, you know. My God, he got up and come the length of the land and took me on his knee like a little child, you know, and we talked there for quite a while. And I never thought that was an awful big event.
That's quite a story about Mr. John L. Sullivan from Mr. Fred Holliday here in Massena, and I'm awful sorry that our time is just about run out for this Saturday. We have been speaking with Mr. Fred Holliday, the last gentleman who was telling that story about John L. Sullivan, a newspaper man of years gone back in Massena, a gentleman who was born in 1875, according to his records, and Mr. Anthony Tony Romeo, the town historian for Massena. It's been a pleasure having you gentlemen here again this morning. Mr. Holliday, I'd like to thank you for coming down again.
Well, you're welcome. If I can help anybody, why, you know, people will say, well, they having him up there, but that's all right.
They'll kid you again about being a radio star today, I know. And Tony, thank you for coming down and bringing Mr. Holliday.
Well, thanks for asking. We sure appreciate being asked. And Mr. Holliday, he's thrilled. He's still show you that he's still useful at going on to 89 years old. That's the kind of citizens we build around here.
I might mention just in passing, today is also the 89th birthday of a former president of the United States, Herbert Hoover. How's that for topping off this program? Certainly it is. All righty, this is Ira Zimmerman. We've got news coming up in about 2 minutes. We'll just fill for a little music here.